Hello and welcome to the One Life Church devotional series where we cover the entire Bible in 20 months. Well, today's chapters are 1 Chronicles 9 and 10. Now 1 Chronicles 9 outlines the people that first returned to Israel. And it says in verse 2, now the first to resettle in their own property, in their own towns, were some of Israelites, priests, Levites, and temple servants. It's almost like the chronicler is saying, the tide has turned, we're going back to our promised land, and God is reestablishing worship. We're going to get the show on the road in the right way this time. And so he mentions the official in charge of the house of God. He mentions 1,760 men who are responsible for the ministry in the house of God. The gatekeepers who were going to make sure that there was not a desecration of this house of God again. And then those who are in charge of the stuff that had to happen in the temple. They would spend the night stationed around the house of God. Those are the people that looked after the things in the treasury. Some were in charge of the articles, and then others in charge of making the bread. And then the musicians, which were the heads of the Levite family, stayed in rooms of the temple and were exempt from all other duties. How's that, musos? Didn't have to do the cooking of bread, the killing of bulls, that sort of thing. Why? Because their responsibilities were to work night and day, to worship night and day. So you can see what the chronicler is doing. He's saying, now that we're coming back to Israel, now that we're coming back to the promised land, we're not going to worship idols. We're going to put worship of God in the center of what we do. And then we get to Chronicles chapter 10. Now this is where most people start reading Chronicles, quite frankly. You've done very well plowing through chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which is a list of people that were in exile. But chapter 9 is like the start of a look of Israel's history. Now he goes back in time, and he doesn't worry about the inauguration of Saul, the many chapters that's the book of Samuel looked at the book of Saul. No. He goes straight to Saul's death. And he says this, now the Philistines fought against Israel, and the Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead at Mount Gilboa. And then he says, look, Saul was wounded, so he's sitting with his armor bearer, and he says, kill me. The armor bearer says, no, I'll never do that. And so Saul falls on his own sword. His armor bearer sees the tragedy, kills himself. And then it says the entire royal family dies. Now we know 1 or 2 made it through, but he's basically saying Saul's family's dead. And then he says when the people of Israel saw this, they absolutely fled. Now, I am down here in Cape Town, and you will see in a few minutes behind me is the main road running through Sea Point, and this is the day of the Cape Town Marathon. So we like in between batches. We're going to see a huge batch coming past in a moment, and I wonder what it was like when the children of Israel ran. Their king was dead. They just packed up their goods and ran. I mean, look at this mass of people running past me. I think there's 12,000 people going to be running in this race. Just a mass of humanity sprinting. The closest thing I think I can find to what it must have been like in those days. And then, he devotes the rest of this chapter to say, this is what happened. Saul's head was decapitated. His body was hung out to dry. His head was taken to the temple of Dagon's temple and hung up there. And then it says, the very last chapter, and Saul died because he was unfaithful to the Lord and did not keep the word of the Lord, and he consulted the medium for guidance and did not inquire of the Lord. So the Lord put him to death and handed over his kingdom to David. Interesting that the history of Israel for this chronicler doesn't start into entering the promised land, doesn't start with the selecting of a king, doesn't start there where the other historians start. Now he starts basically, why are we in such a mess? Because we had a king like Saul. And then he moves to the kingship of David. So now we start the real history of Israel as seen through this chronicler, and we'll pick that up tomorrow.